Everyone ready? Cool. Let's invent some more imaginary people. We have Ben. He lives in his mom's basement. He doesn't emit very much carbon. He doesn't travel. He doesn't have a job. When he does travel, he uses public transit. Now, we also have, I don't know, Jacob, and he's the CEO of a green energy company. And he flies all around the world in order to promote solar panels, help give them to developing countries. He is sentenced to death in this world, but our basement dweller, in the worst adverse selection problem ever created, lives longer. We are going to bring three arguments from opening opposition. First, this is not required and it is deeply unfair. Second, this will destroy economies starting tomorrow. And third, it might not work. First, why is it unfair and not needed? There was very little argumentation from opening gov that explained why, among the many problems that we face, climate change is the single most severe one. Poverty kills. Extreme poverty kills. The developing world, which needs to emit carbon in the short term in order to have any hope of advancing economically, is also harmed. Also, it is not clear the degree of moral culpability that exists. That is, definitely emitting carbon harms another individual. Whether the amount of carbon in terms of the scale of this policy that one person emits to move up 1 year or one rung on the scale proportionately kills another person by the same degree is a moral question the opening government doesn't seem to answer. But moreover, even if I accept the general premise that people are responsible for their actions, the fact that we are not responsible for being born into the one moment in human society where there's tons of carbon and tons of industrialization, sure, we benefit, but that doesn't mean that our lives should be materially worse, chaotic. We can't predict our future. How do you financially plan in this world? You know where the benchmark is going. You know what your life is going to be look like. If you become successful and you start, I don't know, traveling or simply just like you've got some wealth, so you want to spend it on things, then you are going to directly suffer. So it's the most massive disincentive to doing anything productive with your life. Wanting on a societal level to increase economic development, but also on an individual level. The structures of society exist. We had to fly here, we have to fly home, and we're going to get wrinkles for it in government's world. But second of all, it is not clear why this policy is necessary. No work is being done in opening government to explain why we don't have a sufficient level of political capital to handle climate change. It is the most severe problem that we probably face in the world right now, but it is one that is increasingly clear that it will be resolved to a satisfactory degree. Sea levels will rise. People will suffer, people will die. Whether more people will suffer and die from climate change than will benefit from economic development as it continues is the open question. We also have a set of policy tools. We have carbon taxes, which are increasingly being committed to by countries all around the world. We have massive amounts of political will because people are tangibly aware of the threat of climate change. And so, yes, there is a lag. People are selfish. They cannot internalize the consequences of their actions. With public policy, they can. Therefore, it is not clear that the amount of harm that government puts onto people is commensurate with what is actually needed. But second, I want you to consider what this does to society on a very practical level. People begin to age at different rates. Young children, sure, they have less culpability, I assume, in this world, but let's say like we're in high school, we're in university, people begin to diverge from each other in age group very fast. So even maintaining traditional structures like, I don't know, schools or advancement through university becomes incredibly difficult. But also, and I assume opening government intends to implement this tomorrow because the word replacement in the motion, the structures of Western society which exist begin to collapse in front of us. And the reason why, maybe that's good, I don't know, we'll find out. But I'd suggest it's quite bad. The reason why is that the per capita basis that actually exists for the world is actually, compared to the majority of developed countries, extremely low. It is like way, way below the standard of living that we presently enjoy. And the consequence of that is that the way that the scale works, of course it's linear, I accept that it's linear, is just really bad for all of us. And yes, we bear moral culpability. Yes, we have blood on our hands. The problem with the motion is the way that it assigns blame and the way that it adversely selects onto people who are doing things that cause blood in the short term, but benefit society in the long run. You run a business, you must fly around. You just enjoy the fruits of your labor because you're being incentivized by the fact that you can, I don't know, like buy wine or food or eat nice steak. And those are all motivations that exist for people to want to do things and gather wealth. Then even if the behavior that a whole country is doing, like, I don't know, burning wood because that is just like a cheap way. And like, yes, you could pay more money for other electricity, but you're kind of stuck in a sense, even though you have some level of culpability. Those people are being punished in Proposition's world. And so it seems clear on some level that economies must radically change. But economy is radically changing because immediately tomorrow, the CEO of every company all around the world realizes that, you know, he's 60 and he's going to die tomorrow, involves a level of social chaos and destruction that is far larger than what government is imagining. On the individual level, it means that people suddenly age. I mean, probably, like, we don't know exactly how the scale is calibrated, but, you know, some people probably have 5 or 6 years left to live. Some people immediately visualize that their life is going crazy. Yes, people can control this. They can begin reducing consumption. They can really hate this. But the question is, does this help us solve climate change in the next 10 years? Does it actually increase the capacity for us to deal and like create solar panels and adapt and build seawalls and so on? Because these impacts seem to matter quite clearly in the next 10 years that we actually have a society that doesn't collapse and can effectively tackle these issues. And I think the response to this policy politically is that everyone's greedy and they want a greater percentage of the per capita basis. They all want to have bigger shares. The consequence is that there's a very large incentive for the powerful countries in the world, developed countries, to want to hold back the developing world from economic development because they want to hog more of the potential points. And on the individual level, I think this exists too. Insofar as there are political outcomes from opening government, you want everyone else to have smaller shares of the pie because eventually, if the baseline goes lower and then people are, begin responding, then it's a zigzag pattern in the sense that people begin to be afraid of death in their world, and therefore they presumably reduce their consumption to a degree. And that brings down the level in the short term, meaning that people begin to get higher shares, and they begin to be able to consume more. But the chaos that happens with the zigzag is the problem, because there's very low predictability about how long people can live and how their individual lifestyles match up successfully. Closing, yes.
So this is about your aggregate carbon footprint, which means your introduction doesn't make any sense because the renewable CEO has obviously done way more good for the environment than their individual players.
I think it is somewhat model dependent, but I'm willing to accept that like the most charitable illustration is potentially out, maybe. But I guess the broader point is that if we look at the way the info slide is written, it's mostly about the individual level, direct and indirect, but individuals' energy usage, travel habits, dietary choices, and consumption patterns. If you start going way too far down the logical chain of events, then no one can actually predict what their real consumption is. Because like we actually don't know, we don't know today which green energy companies are going to save the world. You might run a green energy company that might go bankrupt. We can't retroactively, it doesn't know the future, I guess is the broader point. So on some level, it has to be direct to the individual. I reject that characterization. I think that the end point of this is quite clear. We do have an adverse selection problem because in order to improve the world, we need to emit now. People need to do things that involve lots of emissions. And the reality is that a lot of people who are doing a lot of good in terms of their lives, innovation for the planet, wealthy countries that need to build the technology that help us to build solar panels and solve problems in the short term will be adversely selected on by this policy. But moreover, the level of chaos that it creates in society compared to the fact that we are going to have imperfect but okay political solutions to climate change is vastly disproportionate compared to the moral problem that it solves. Ultimately, this was somewhat unfair, somewhat unpleasant, and not necessary. We're very proud to oppose.
I can't speak of their fine speech, and I will call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
LSE. No thanks.
I'm not anything on.
Oh shit, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just gonna check that you're definitely off.
How do I turn this off? Do I just click end?
No, like close the camera and the audio.
Oh.
Some pleasantries first. Thanks so much, Max, for debating with me. This has been super, super fun and one of the best ones I've done. England and Europe is cool. I've been having a really great time. I've loved all the motions so far. And thanks to all of our opponents and everyone I spoke against at this tournament. The problem with this motion is it happens in an unequal world, a world where decision-making is unfortunately concentrated in the hands of a few countries in which the bulk of economic activity happens, but which affects the lives and the livelihoods of everyone else on the planet. This doesn't just hurt people in the developed world who emit, it also hurts people in developing nations who lose access to economic growth that's necessary for alleviating immediate suffering. Two clashes in the debate. First, the most charitable possible interpretation to Gov and talking about their best case about alleviating climate change and explaining why we achieve it better before talking about the enormous and immediate harms that happen with the revelation of this policy, of people becoming vigilantes, for example, of violence erupting between countries, because you suddenly realize that aging is speeding up, slowing down, that people are on the brink of death if they're consuming a lot and if they're very old, for example. Okay, first then, on climate change and which side is actually able to solve it better. I think OG is unfortunately probably out because they have some good intuitions on why people might consume less, but none of it is terminalized. There's very, very little impact on probability work done, so I leave it to CG to do the actual work. Before that, though, I just want to say that I think even if CG does an amazing job, that very, very little is able to be achieved when it comes to changing the way in which climate change works. The reason for this is as follows. The first thing is you cannot get people to all stop consuming at the same time because there's an enormous collective action problem, i.e., yes, sure, maybe I'm going to stop consuming right now, but I have no awareness whatsoever about how other people are going to be consuming, which means I reach the benchmark and then I start consuming again, for example. But number two, also because I think that there's a limited amount that can be done by each individual in the West to reduce your consumption, because you have to go to work to retain a salary and continue to buy food, for example. You live in a house that's fueled by electricity. You do things such as eat meat. You do things such as like I don't know, travel places. Like all of this emits an enormous amount of energy that you cannot opt out of, especially if you work in an industry where there's a large amount of emissions that are being produced all the time. What that means then is that people don't reduce consumption immediately. But number two, even if they do, even if consumption in the West reduces to 10% of what it currently is, that's not enough to adequately slow climate change. And the reason for this is because it's a ball that continues to roll and that becomes larger and larger as time passes by. The reason why experts have already said that we passed the tipping point many, many years ago is because as you increase more and more carbon into the atmosphere, it starts to trap more and more rays, etc. Icebergs melt. The fact that icebergs melt means that you don't reflect radiation back into the atmosphere, and a lot of trapped carbon becomes released. Basically, climate change is irreversible. There's a ton of momentum that cannot be taken away. So for those reasons, conditions continue to worsen. What's the counterfactual? What do we actually want to achieve with regards to climate change? Because having temperature remain stable is not a goal in and of itself. What we care much, much more about is the way in which it affects people and whether it causes suffering. What's much more important is climate adaptation. So, for example, ensuring that we develop more and more crops that are able to survive and thrive in warmer environments, for example, is doing things such as finding other ways to live in a warmer world wherein there's more and more fluctuation in weather, where sea levels rise, for example, is the development of seawalls, the development of carbon capture sinks, all of these things that require a lot of economic activity right now. That becomes substantially more difficult on their side because they have to find people who are willing to take the L and shorten their own lives because they're continuously working a lot. They continue to live in cities that are extremely expensive when it comes to carbon emissions, for example, and that becomes much, much more difficult. The success rate and the amount of time it takes to successfully implement these things dramatically goes down. Why is it actually really, really positive on our side? A few reasons for this. The first reason is because the oil and gas industry has broadly realized that given that they plan to exist in 20, 30 years, that they're going to transition to forms of energy production that don't rely on fossil fuels. That's why there's so much aggressive research and VC into green forms of energy production, for example. But number two, I also think it's the case that this spreads to the developing world increasingly as these links break down and as globalization becomes faster and people realize they want to go back to their home countries and find ways to make people's lives better. Poverty kills people in a way that climate change doesn't. If you have money, you survive the after effects of climate change. It's unconscionable for Gov to expect people to just change their lifestyles before they benefit from these things. I think the developed world reacts not by having everyone become green, but by freezing global economic activity everywhere else. The reason for this is because there is mass panic when this motion happens, right? Because abruptly, your understanding of how aging happens changes very, very quickly. The consumption of someone in the developed world, in the West, is way, way, way over the baseline by the degree of magnitude, not by a degree of a little bit. And the reason for this is because you need enormous cuts in the carbon emissions in order to maintain the same amount of temperature. Like all the plans you have for how carbon emissions are going to work have like, we should slow carbon emissions until it reaches the baseline, and this will happen gradually until 2050, for example. But all of this assumes that the climate is continuing to worsen until you've reached that phase, which means the amount that's required to consume right now to prevent that from happening is extremely, extremely low. It's very, very late. And I think that the reason why this matters then is that in the developing world, the populations are relatively large and people don't consume very much at all, which is that the cuts must all come from a very small percentage of the population in the developed world. What that means then is that people in the West want to cut emissions as soon as possible right now. And it's far, far easier to do this by slowing economic activity and putting that on a moratorium in their best case scenario. That is to say that you do things such as cut development aid because you don't want China or you don't want Bangladesh to suddenly start industrializing and emitting more and more, because that decreases the amount of budget that everyone else in the West has, for example, and it accelerates aging for us. You do things such as try to block economic activity right now because there's a mass panic on whether things are going to continue or stay the same in the future. All of this means this is true because you have certainty. They can buy time this way as opposed to gradually hoping they're able to transition away to a more sustainable way of living in the future. And I think that that is why people's lives become so, so much worse on their side, because as supply chains get cut, people who rely on sustainable purchases of their grain or of their textiles in order to survive lose all their income. They scramble to find another way to live life, but the world has become irreversibly dependent on a model of life that depends on all of this. People in the future don't exist yet. They may never be born. Suffering right now is immediate, it is certain, it matters far, far more. We want to prevent the acute suffering, not just the people in the West, but across the entire world right now, and are willing to sacrifice the future to do this. Happy to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech. I thank everyone on the top half for their contributions thus far. I warmly call upon the member of government.
Yeah, exactly. That is my general personality.
Before I start, I'm gonna thank Zarina. She's been my partner for the way too many years that I've been doing this activity, and she's been able to put up with my shit. Her kindness and intelligence have shone throughout, and I think this is a great way to end our time debating together. Especially with the case I'm about to write here. All right. Who is it who benefits from the extended life? It's obviously not most of the people in this room, let's face it, we're probably fucked. But who does benefit are people in the developing world who have relatively low carbon emissions and have a huge healthcare benefit as a result of that. Our case is that these people and these countries will develop massively as a result, directly flipping, I think, the best contribution coming out of opening opposition. I'm also going to talk about how this is interpreted as an act of God if I have time. All right, first of all, extended lives in developing world. So who has extended lives? I think it's obviously not the people who could do things like fly or just be flown out everywhere or buy things that come from all around the world. Rather, it's people who have a relatively constrained set of choices and who have contexts where these kind of options aren't available to them in the very first place, i.e. people in the developing world itself. Now, opening opposition say, but you still might have to be a slash and burn farmer or something. Yes, but they didn't read the info slide because it says it's influenced by the extent to which you have choice over this thing. So if your only path to survival is by being a slash and burn farmer, for instance, then that will be offset and that doesn't matter as much. And so at least comparatively, you have a far more extended lifespan than the rich guy in the West who just chooses to, I don't know, buy a pineapple that's been come from halfway across the world and it's basically pointless. Which means, essentially, the end point of this is that these people in these countries who have these constrained option sets live far longer than they otherwise would, and crucially, far longer than all of their relative competition they might face in the West. And I want to explain why this is really important. The first thing is that I think this solves the key economic problem that people in the developing countries face. The key economic problem is premature death, particularly premature death of the people who are earning in these families. The reason is that we're talking about contexts where there's no social security, where it's not normalized for women to work, for instance, so widows dying is really terrible, where there's very low levels of financial planning, and where there's relatively poor healthcare systems. So you add a stroke, fix that, right? Because essentially, all of these people now live for far, far longer, and so they don't require these things, or they think about that in a far longer term. So I think that's really, really good, because the key barrier that we're talking about in the poorest context now goes away, insofar as these people aren't constantly at risk of premature death. Rather, they can benefit from all the forces that we're talking about. I think the response is essentially, well, Western investment in these areas is going to stop, and that's really terrible. And I'm actually not sure about the extent to which this is the case. Or at least some forms of Western investment are likely to continue. Obviously, for instance, renewable types of investment are likely to continue because, again, it's about your aggregate carbon footprint. So if you're the CEO of a company and you build a solar power plant, then, for instance, your life is massively extended. But also, secondly, and I think this is crucial, that actually investment is likely to flood in as a result. Because essentially what happens is these workers in these poorer countries become the people who live for the longest possible time. And so they're the best possible workers, but you don't need to constantly replace them. Whereas in the West, you probably do because your natural rate of living is far lower. And so life itself becomes a kind of tradable commodity. And crucially, it becomes a tradable commodity that favors these contexts, which means at the end of that, investment is likely to flood in. But even if Western investment is entirely cut off, taking opening opposition at their best, that's still a huge benefit in these contexts. The reason is very simple. A longer life is really good for these individuals on an individual level. It gives them more time to think, to explore the interests they want to pursue, rather than just being forced into doing things as a result of the constrained set of options they face. They can do things like pursue more important forms of education, for instance. They can plan into the long term. They can use that more and more. And crucially, they can develop things that ensure their comparative advantage, namely a longer life, is maintained. For the reason that obviously what they can do is, for instance, when they do things like innovative things or develop forms of innovation, they can do so in a way that is guaranteed to not have as much climate impact as possible. And so that path dependency is far better because the nature of innovation itself is far better off. So the end point of all of this is basically we solve the key problem that a lot of countries in the world face. We extend the lifespans of the most vulnerable people in the world, and we give them the capacity to make a genuinely meaningful life and a good life for themselves. XK, yeah.
The reason lifestyles on average 20 years shorter in the DRC than in Japan has nothing to do with the rate of natural aging and everything to do with disease, poor nutrition, pollution, things that you
Right, but things like disease and poor nutrition, for instance, directly affect your natural long-term lifespan, right? And that is exactly what we're solving. All right, second of all, why does this massively empower religion and why is that a good thing? So let's be clear about what happens as a result of this motion. It's not a principle. It's not like, oh, climate change or whatever. It is literally oil CEOs melt away like the ending of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, right? That's what the motion is, right? So, what will this look like? I think it looks like an act almost of divine intervention, because essentially what it looks like is that the main fear that people have in the world, the unifying fear of death, is now massively changed in the way that it works. And how are people going to respond to this? Well, they're probably going to respond through the framework of how they live in the world and how they understand things, their worldview, which in many cases is religion. But even if you're an atheist and suddenly a switch changes and now if you're terrible for the climate, then you just die, like literally real life karma, you're probably going to interpret that in a way that shows, at the very least, if not a belief in God, then a belief in a kind of moral system. And that, I think, is really, really important, because essentially there's a switch that's flipped overnight, or the oil CEOs melt away, all of this stuff. But that's really good because the way that people view and interpret that is important. They view it as seeing that their main moral obligation in life is to adhere to the climate and is to, for instance, improve what the green world looks like. And that's really good because essentially it gives them a concrete path they need in order to be motivated, an act of faith rather than any kind of rational reason of itself. Essentially an eco-cult. But an eco-cult is something, I think, that is really good because when you have that kind of faith in the system, that is what makes you willing to do any kind of sacrifice, essentially, to alleviate the climate in and of itself. You have a kind of internal organization. You have your faith that's created the day after this motion occurs that tells you that the main thing you need to do is solve the climate. And that, I think, is really good because essentially it means that all the kind of quibbles about, oh, people are rational in this way, not that way, that happen on top half about whether or not you solve the climate are solved because the way that society responds to this and the way that individuals respond within that framework is likely to be extraordinarily good. They believe that their main or moral obligation in life and what they get rewarded for essentially is extending the climate, and so they benefit massively from that. And maybe they just live a better life overall because they are oriented by those moral positions far more. So at the end of this, we do two crucial things. We first of all massively increase development for the reason that now these places have a unique comparative advantage, but we second of all ensure that essentially people live far more moral and decent lives because essentially this is a proof that karma in some sense exists and that probably leads to really significant benefits. Very proud to propose.
Thank you for their fine speech, and I will be called upon the member of opposition.
Panel ready? Cool. The central question in this debate is one of autonomy. That is, whether or not we believe the benefit of combating climate change is worth the cost we impose on the lives of individuals by robbing them of the days, months, and years, or arguably worse, the experiences they give up by aging quicker and by making choices to avoid aging quicker. While I would gladly give up years of my life to visit my girlfriend in Zagreb every weekend and burn emissions doing that, I think it's abhorrent that the elderly woman should have to choose between her last years on Earth and a flight to see her dying sister. I furthermore think it is morally abhorrent that we subject individuals to the tyranny of aging and make them gaze into the void without giving them any recourse to alter that, given these choices are determined and made by other individuals. That's what I'm incredibly proud to stand against closing up. Before that, I want to frame out the opening half of this debate. Opening half is thinking of this representing as a far more radical change than it does. Note that the info slide was written by very smart people, has built-in mechanisms to account for the degree of radical change this would engender in status quo. That is to say, it holds some individuals more responsible than others, and the cost of the policy choices that enact emissions, i.e. voting in governments that engage in emissions, is diffused across the population because different people have different degrees of responsibility for wielding the levers of power and voting in the politicians that engage in those actions in the first place. So presumably somebody who casts a vote in favor of a politician who produces emissions gets significantly less of the responsibility than someone who doesn't do that. But moreover, societies will probably find ways to account for this. For example, there are specific decisions that probably bear a specifically high carbon cost, like the decision to engage in drilling for oil that can be passed to specific groups of people. Like, I don't know, people who don't mind dying young or people who don't mind aging more quickly, and so on and so forth. And CEOs will probably work out a way to abuse that. But thirdly, people are probably going to get used to this, right? Like, for example, this is a change that happens fairly gradually. The intuition pump for this is that when I smoke a cigarette, I don't think about each cigarette and the impact it has on my life individually. Rather, I think about that I'm enjoying it and that I'm living life habitually, and I become habituated and acclimated to it over a period of time. The comparative is on their side of the house. People become habituated to that, and at worst, there's one big shock in the short term, but very quickly, probably things revert to the way that they were relatively rapidly. With that in mind, I think that marginalizes both the claim that we will all become living in an eco-hippie commune on opening government, but I think it also marginalizes the worst excesses of opening opposition who claim the economy will collapse, everything will no longer be able to function, and everything will fail as a result. With that in mind, what is important in this debate? I think the first claim is that this is principally abhorrent. I think that aging is terrible, and inflicting it at others, even at a slow pace, in a way in which they cannot control properly as a mechanism of punishment is particularly terrible. And as important framing, this stands independent of whether you believe my initial framing about whether or not Topif is correct about this debate. Because O does a good job questioning the efficacy of the policy and whether it can be achieved by other means, and we will rise above this by explaining independent of policy outcomes we win. So this is not contingent on you believing my initial framing, even though I think you should. Why is this a disproportionate punishment relative to the degree of capacity people have to govern their lives, even with the mitigation mechanisms in the info slide? 5 reasons for this. Firstly, your lifespan is impacted by the choices of people around you. Whether this is somebody cooking a steak dinner for you without your consent, as is the example in the info slide, or in choosing a power company, when you choose to embrace octopus energy over a different kind of energy company in the UK, choosing it from a source that engages in greater emissions or derives fuel from a power source that is less environmentally friendly. But secondly, it's arbitrarily based on your profession that you could lead to live a shorter life. That is, you maintain a power station or work for a company that runs them. Suddenly your life is significantly more impacted than if you did not. But thirdly, the birth lottery constrains capacity to avoid impact of other people's choices to a large degree. If you have more money, you have greater capacity to seclude yourself from elsewhere or move away from people who are engaging in emissions. If you live in a place where you have more education about how climate change impacts your day-to-day life, you have a better understanding of how these targets, which might work like ESG or something like that, work, as opposed to someone who doesn't have that capacity. You still make choices, you still have the consequences of that individual action, but you're just more exposed to having make more choices, and therefore the punishment is more disproportionate on their side. But even if none of this is true, the belief that other people's actions dominates your life far more and creates constraints on your actions, we think that's bad. So it restricts the ability and degree of choice by which you're able to live your life commensurate with the amount of other options and agents you have. But finally, you are arbitrarily born into an area based on geographic constraints in which you exist that create more incentives for you to make bad choices, right? So if I need air conditioning because I live in a country that you need air conditioning in order to get through very hot summers, for example, I'm going to harm significantly more than another person. This is a choice, maybe of necessity, maybe of convenience, but nonetheless still determinative of where you live and where you were born, right? I know it's discounted based on agency limitations that exist in status quo, but these are still choices. We're not saying that these people don't have responsibility for those choices or making any moral claim there. We're just saying that the people who make these choices deserve sympathy, and the punishment is arbitrarily incredibly harmful. There are 2 harms to this, principally and practical. First principled harm is it cuts against the conception of the self that people want to present to the world, limits their choices, limits their agency, and forces restrictions upon them that we think are inherently harmful. But moreover, I think there's a serious practical impact here too, and that is that aging is terrible, panel. I think it's a disproportionate punishment for something that you can never truly enact control over. But more than that, I think insofar as even you do contribute to it and you're a worse person, it's still not something I wish on people. Why is aging bad? Firstly, I think as you grow older, you begin to see your life flash before your eyes. You begin to worry about what comes afterward. You begin to stare into that void and see nothing staring back at you. You begin to think about that eternal nothingness that exists at the end of your life that you were never able to escape from. But secondarily, as you become weaker, your body degrades in its capacity to engage in things. Your mind becomes slower, and you become fearful of that lack of agency that you have with the ability to govern your life. Moreover, if you believe this is a choice, as Anaket says, it's imposed by a god, you probably believe that god is evil because you're being punished for choices other people made rather than your own. Or you don't have a moral system in your head because you're not an Ivy League educated wanker who believes that climate change is the only problem that exists in the world, and therefore, because you have a different moral framework, you don't understand even why you're being punished in the first place. So it's unlikely to lead you to making a more moral life. The reason this is more important than any other impact is threefold. Firstly, everyone experiences this. Everyone experiences this to a degree, greater or lesser, and I think that is bad. It's more important than anything else. But secondly, it's more certain and affects everyone, far more certain than the possibility of economic collapse and opening opposition. But thirdly, I think it's the most salient impact in the round, because regardless of what other solutions exist to mitigate this, this applies irrespective of how the world ultimately looks on their side of the house. Before I go on closing, if you have something. Opening.
No.
Guessing I'm winning. That's very telling, panel. Make a note. The second principled claim I want to make, it also wins independent of practical harms, is that this applies even in the case it works perfectly. This god, or whatever does this, is using people as a social battering ram whose lives are being instrumentalized to solve a problem. Our claim is that my life belongs to me alone, and the classic intuition pump against utilitarianism that says you shouldn't take out the organs of one person to save lives of 5 people applies here. We think that individuals have the greatest capacity to determine the way in which they lead their lives, and this is the intuition by which we consider democratic systems to be just, and why we oppose things like wrongful imprisonment and so on and so forth. Insofar as we believe human beings are moral agents and are accorded rights that the state and other actors shouldn't infringe upon, we think that that's incredibly impactful. Therefore, we think what this world amounts to is making those moral agents into a means to an end. Our claim is that it is always wrong, regardless of practical outcomes, to instrumentalize someone and use them as a battering ram for social, political, or economic progress. This is the classic thought experiment against utilitarianism I already talked about. It's also we don't jail random people as a deterrent against crime in the status quo. Importantly, insofar as this is true, we think this world is one in which individuals are instrumentalized to solve a social good, and we think that is incredibly harmful, more than anything else that they say in the debate. The final claim I want to weigh up is why these harms are worse than what other teams give us. OG says you get rid of obstacles fighting climate change. It's beaten by OO, but I'm unclear why people end up living in a Berkeley commune. Anyway, on OO, the best argument they have in this debate is will crush the global economy. I'm uncertain that that's true. It might create a defect mentality whereby more people engage in defection and things like that. CG says people lead more moral lives. I already explained what that is, not essential. Look, panel. Aging is the worst tyranny that you can subject anyone to in the world. Do not go quietly into the night. Do not subject people to the tyranny of the void. Instead, embrace life, embrace choice, embrace agency, embrace the principle. Never been more practical.
I thank our speakers for their fine speech, and I warmly call upon the government.
Yeah, just quickly before I start, because I didn't win world, so I didn't get to do this. I've been debating with Annika since I started debating, essentially, and it's been an amazing ride. We've been friends since before we were debating, and that will continue. So thank you so much, Annika. Okay, now for the fun stuff. The first thing I want to do is explain why CO aren't in this debate, because CO get up and they give you this bleeding heart story about how awful it is that people age and grannies have the void of, dying at 83, forgetting that, if they oppose the motion, they support status quo aging, and there was just as little choice with status quo aging as our world. So given that this house prefers motion, the world that they support is one where people just naturally don't die at long ages if you are from Niger, but die at longer ages if they are from the countries which pollute under the status quo, who are in the future going to harm the capacity of their children in Niger to be able to live a good life. So it's just as arbitrary, that void is just as oppressive and just as arbitrary on their side of the house as on our side of the house. I think even open government are beating this because they actually give you a weighing as to why the people who are harmed by climate change are affected. I just don't get what this case is or why it's relevant to the debate. But secondly, they say that it is disproportionate because you have less info and you have less choices and you have more constraints. Isn't it great that the CA set a motion where if you have less info, less choices and more constraints, then you are less likely to be affected by it in the first place, which scales down the impact and the harm to you of the aging. And if you're below the benchmark because you are the people with the least amount of info, the least amount of choices and the most constraints, you're the people in Niger who are likely to have a slower aging process than average, which was literally our case. What Harish is, and I want to be clear because Harish sounds amazing. What he's going to have to do in this speech in order to win this debate is explain to us why the void of somebody or all of you sitting here, the most privileged people, is worth more than those people. That's a tough ask, and so they're out of the debate. What did we bring you? We brought you two things. The first thing was an explanation as to why this is likely to massively increase the life expectancy of individuals who suffer the most in this world. And it's not just about climate change. It's about the other things that mean that your life is likely to be shorter, the other deprivations and constraints, the rampant colonialism which has led to the situation of these countries. And yes, those are exogenous to the motion, but the incidental impact of that is that these individuals pollute less and therefore they uniquely benefit from this policy. The response that we get from opening opposition is to say, but wars happen in the Congo and yeah, malaria exists, which is true, but by the definition of the motion, the natural process of which things like malnutrition influence is likely to be far, far shorter, which means that you are likely to just have a longer life on the comparative. And I want to be very clear, this wasn't just about how long these people live, it was also in terms of our mechanism about investment, about the margin of life difference between you and somebody in the West. Because even if we can't prove that their life goes up by more than 10 years, we can prove, because it is the premise of their case, that lives literally capitulate in the West are far shorter, which means that that flow of investment is far more likely to happen on our side of the house. Because think about how investment works. You have to be able to plan, as opening opposition very helpfully told us. And therefore there is a shift where the certainty of return means that you are likely to get those capital flows. People might even migrate to these countries, bring expertise and bring their capacity to help these countries because they want to live because they can make the choice and they want to live in environments now uniquely where they're able to not pollute to a greater extent to save their lives. And also, as Annika told you, individuals still have incentives to invest in these countries for the reason that it is a lower net carbon decision, but also for the reason that it is a moral thing to do insofar as you are able to alleviate your burden on the environment by being able to invest in these places. So I think we prove at least some scale that these countries get some problems solved. And crucially, even if we don't prove any of that, we prove that we, at least to some extent, deal with the pernicious impact of premature death. Because when a widow is left with 5 kids and a husband who has died, on whom she was massively dependent, that destroys that family. It is one of the biggest causes of inequality in the developing world. Even when countries are making the right decisions, the constraint is that people fall through the cracks, and we stop people from falling through the cracks. We allow families to plan, we allow education to occur, which wouldn't have otherwise occurred, and that is a huge margin in debate. Don't let them trivialize our case, because it matters and it is relevant directly as a result of of the wording of the motion. But we had a second extension, and this is the one that I'm really proud of. God, because when Indiana Jones shit happens, when these CEOs disappear overnight, that is important. Think about what that looks like. Think, in fact, just use opening opposition framing. And by the way, just as a side note, CEO are knifing them when they say that things are going to normalize. So I'm going to use opening opposition's framing because that is the first one that happened in the debate. The rules. So what happens in this context? What happens in this situation? I want to note that the best religions, the religions that had these most stringent institutions that brought people together through collective action, that made people think about things above themselves, occurred at the point at which shit happened that hit the fan, at the point at which social chaos and disorder disintegrated, that individuals had to latch onto something and find something to believe in. I think that I'm going to flip opening opposition and say it is an actively good thing if you get that chaos and disorder in the West, because from the births of that you get a profit, and from that profit you get an eco-ideology, and from eco-ideology we actually get a religious and devoted drive to save the environment. Now, I want to be very clear why this is important, because capacity is not the biggest constraint on solving climate issues. Opening government identify this, but the problem with opening government is they say, now India is going to come to the table and China is going to come to the table and COP27 is going to be better than COP26. We're talking about the fanaticism of religion here. We're talking about people giving all of their money, all of their possessions, all of their belongings to avoid that death. We are talking about individuals sacrificing everything to ensure that the earth matters, to treat the trees and the planets and all of that fluffy shit as though it is their reason to live. I think that that proves a huge marginal difference in the will and the scale that people have to save the environment. That saves millions or billions of animals. That saves future generations in lower standards of living, but it literally improves the lives of everyone who comes after. Opening opposition very quickly.
We need social stability, technology, and no, the world's not slowing down to solve climate change in the next 10 years. Why are your marginal impacts on climate change compared to the progress we show now worth the human cost?
Because you aren't showing progress on climate change, and even though you tell opening government that they don't prove that we are on a trajectory of being fucked, you actually don't prove that there's any solvency or that we are on a trajectory. And I would point out that we are not on a trajectory. The XA tries to reframe this by saying, well, we're fucked anyway because we're past the point of no return. But that's actually not true. Otherwise, we wouldn't still be having these COPs. The whole point of the science behind climate change is once you reach certain points, there are certain harms which are going to occur, but the mitigation still matters and the scale and the degree still matters. So it may be true that we are past the point where, I don't know, Tuvalu or whatever is going to be underwater, and that's really bad. No, but it's bad. Like these are nations, it's bad. But the next degree, 2 degrees, is Bangladesh. The next degree is the Netherlands. The next degree is the UK. This scale is, I just don't know why they're minimizing this argument. And I'm kind of surprised because I actually thought that we had a ridiculous case. But the more I'm speaking, the more I realize that I really have. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for their fine speech, and to conclude the case of the opposition and the debate as a whole, I formally call upon the opposition win.
Like many people in this room, I smoke cigarettes. Most of us know there are certain things which you can eat, which probably are bad for your health and mean that you are going to die sooner. Many people could go to the gym and as a result be healthier, but still decide not to do it. People put themselves under a huge amount of stress, even though they know it is bad for their lifespan and bad for their life. Here's the truth. The misconception in this debate is that this policy radically shifts human behavior. It doesn't. It may be a sharp shift at the beginning, but by day 10, by day 20, and definitely a year later, people are far less likely to even care about this signal at all. We will do what we want to do and ultimately say, fuck it, even if it means that the quality of our lives and the length of our lives is reduced. There are several reasons why I think that is actually the most likely outcome in this debate. The first one is our revealed preferences of the kind of behavior we engage in right now, and almost every single one of us engages in right now. The second reason is the way in which we deal with information and new ways of life. There are things, for instance, we just accept as the way life is, and it changes in that way. We all accept that aging is in fact natural. In this case, people just start accepting that, yes, some people are going to age at a slightly different rate. I might age at a slightly different rate, but it is worth it for me because things I like. Other people who will have a desirability bias will go like, it's fine. It probably isn't even that bad in these cases. Aging isn't that bad. Why does all this matter in the debate? If you actually listen to all the other teams, they assume there'll be a sharp shift in how behaviors change. I actually don't think that is true. Maybe with the exception of the CEO of an oil company where it could be slightly greater. But in that case, what likely happens is you simply have a diversion of blame. The person who is most responsible is probably the person who goes, fine, give me a few $1 million, and as a result, I'll end up taking that risk in a lower life because that's a trade-off I am willing to take. This is vital in this debate because I actually think this is likely what would happen and would happen relatively quickly. Why does that matter in the context of this debate? First, something I know a lot about, aging. Aging is not good. Aging means it is harder for you to walk, you have more pain. Aging means that your mental capacity is no longer as good as it previously was. Aging makes you worry about when you're going to die and what will happen next. And according to closer government, you are now worried you will melt away because of a vengeful God. I think they're all negative things. Now, they are correct. Obviously, aging happens on both sides of the house. My claim is when it's something which we could each side could deliberately decide whether they accelerate or don't accelerate, it is a cruel and immoral punishment for individuals for a choice they are making for a problem which is probably not even that significant. But even if you don't even if they have the choice, even if the problem is really significant, the harm created is not sufficient. Or a justified punishment. But let's talk about the choices individuals actually make and why we think that we do not have a degree of culpability. This is true even if you don't believe the previous things I say. The first is the notion of knowledge and how we actually understand what the impact on our life is going to be. This is not defined away by the info slide. Why do I say this? Firstly, there are lots of behaviors we're engaged with where we kind of know it impacts our life, but we don't actually know how much it impacts our lives by. In fact, often we just decide that we don't even want to know that information, but more often it isn't even easily available to us. Now, there are also incentives for people to produce those kinds of goods to actually distort the knowledge which is available to us.
Right.
And we're seeing this in the status quo. If you look, for instance, at ESG, which is effectively just a scam, where people decide whether something is actually going to be environmentally conscious or not. It's where we actually don't have the information because it is being produced by individuals who are spreading information which isn't even true. This is important because we don't even have an accurate source of information in the majority of cases. Now, the best case of the proposition is say, well, look, you're obviously going to find out that information. I don't about what cigarettes do to me, but even if that was true, that assumes you can have reliable sources. With the proliferation of information which is available now, fake news, fake news, that we often believe what we want to believe, there aren't really credible sources anymore which allow us to do that. So that's why I think often people won't even have the knowledge of the consequences of their actions. Secondly, because of geographic constraints. The issue here wasn't about choice or a lack of choice. It's the choices that people are making to ensure that their lives are similar to lives in places in other places. Now, air conditioning may sound like a trivial example, but I actually think it's quite salient to prove the point. If you live in a warm country, you want air conditioning to have a reasonable standard of living. That is still a choice you are making, but a harmful choice nonetheless because of where you are born. There are plenty of other choices like this that individuals, because they were born, do things which are negative for the climate, but nonetheless are choices which they make. The third claim we make on this deals with closer government, where they say, but there are many choices wealthy individuals can make, but relatively few poor individuals can make. Well, I have two comments about this. Actually, wealthy individuals are the ones who are often in the best positions to reduce their climate footprint. If you have a lot of money, or at least a reasonable amount of money, you can do what Max talked about at the start of his speech. Just stay out in your basement, but you can still have a reasonable standard of living with your necessities provided, and that's very different than if you are forced to work. And if you're forced to work in a mine, maybe you have some kind of mitigation of it that doesn't eliminate the harm entirely. But first, top up.
Time is a dimension that is just as morally arbitrary as geography, which you clearly care about. There is no response in all of opposition to our principle about this issue.
No, there are arbitrary factors. You have one arbitrary factor. You have two arbitrary factors. We have one. I mean, look, this is a ridiculous actual argument. Yes, there are arbitrary things in the world which lead to punishments. That is not an argument to have an additional one, which is really, really damaging. That is why we just don't think there is a big impact here. The third claim on this is about the individuals where they don't have a choice. This is the main claim which we get from closing government here, where they're like, oh, but isn't it great that people in the developing world can live longer because they don't have choices? Well, let's say that is possibly true, albeit I think they are often forced to work in negative climate areas or semi-forced to work. You could still choose not to work or make less money as a result, but there'll still be an impact on your life. I don't actually think that just because you're in the DRC, you get a free pass in these cases. But even if you do, I think all of the responses from opening opposition kick in, which is that we still need development. The length of your life is not the only important thing. The quality of your life is as well. Finally, the implicit response I guess we get from opening government is, well, maybe you could have some degree of mitigation. You may have some degree of mitigation, but that again is not an individual choice here, because that is a choice which has to be made by a collective and is nonetheless one which can consign us to serious problems. At the end of this debate, there is a claim this is a much larger impact than it does. I think if you reflect on the choices we all make at a day-to-day level, you realize that is at best temporary, and the medium term, what is far more important is far too many people are prematurely forced to age and face the punishments as a result.
And if we give one more round of applause for